All right, welcome everyone to the Beyond Lived Experience podcast after a nearly 2 year hiatus. um, I have a guest with me today, Andrew. Um, how about you introduce yourself, Andrew?
Okay. My name is Andrew Pegram. I've been a peer support specialist for about 5 years now, and I am very passionate about seeing social change and progress within mental health and seeing people have more options and seeing more holistic wellness care be available for people.
Nice, thank you. Um, I'm Nybelle. I've been working as a peer support specialist for 7.5 years. Doesn't really feel like that long. Um, and I'm passionate about systems change. I've worked in a variety of settings, and I'm also currently working as a manager. Um, so I think I'm really passionate about making sure that peer supports are doing, what they should be doing, what the original purpose and intent was, and trying to undo and prevent some of that co-optation. And I also agree that I really want people to have options. Um, so to start off, Andrew, how would you define peer support for yourself?
Peer support, I would say, is a type of care model based in lived experience, and its grassroots origin is community based. And even though it's kind of moved away from that in recent years, I think it's still at the heart of what peer support really means. It's really trying to build community and bring that back into our society in a way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And I mean, I would like pretty much agree with your definition for myself. I will say that I feel like, in terms of um, peer support being more focused on that grassroots piece, it does kind of depend where you look. Because I feel like for myself, I can still find that, I have a couple like meetup groups that I go to that are totally just peer support. Nobody's getting paid to do it. It's like a free group, and everybody's just there supporting each other. There may be one person or two people facilitating, but um, there's not like the potential complications that might come if you are, say, doing peer support at a clinical organization that's very large and has lots of rules and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's definitely pockets of it, and um, some organizations that have peer support are better at keeping it closer to that grassroots focus than others, for sure.
Definitely true. Yeah. I really love how you brought up the groups because I totally agree with that. And it's funny because I guess my focus has just been so much lately on wanting to help migrate peers out of clinical settings. And so, yeah, in a way, I guess I've been kind of hyper focused on that. But I know my heart's also really into those groups, into um, like honestly for myself, like I've been watching lots of YouTube videos and hearing stories from people. Like I've been going through this really deep self discovery journey of trying to find out more about what these different experiences I'm having and symptoms mean. And it's been very helpful for me to just listen to people's stories. And I feel like I get so much more out of that than I would have just going to see a clinician and getting diagnosed, which in the past didn't really work for me.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I think like I do see a therapist, but part of that is because like I don't really have very many options for one-on-one peer support. I did try to look a while back, so I think there's really big difference. Like I can get it in that group setting, but it's really not the same. Um, and my therapist is great, but I think at the end of the day, I probably would prefer like having a one-on-one peer support that I could meet with once a week, um, versus a therapist. Um,
Yeah, totally.
I I do think, there's value to it, and sometimes, like, selfishly, I kind of like that there's not as much mutuality in the therapist client relationship, and I can just kind of, you know, vent, and, like, the other person can be a sounding board for me. But I also kind of think that that's not really, like, a sustainable way to be in the world, and may have caused me to, behave in certain ways in the past, like almost like expecting other people to be my therapist.
Mm.
um, so I think peer support can be a great opportunity to practice like what those healthy relationships look like, not only with the peer but with other folks around us. Because I think it can just be easy to fall into that habit of like talking about what's wrong, and being used to just, other people are gonna just absorb what I'm saying, and like everyone around me is my sounding board.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I've been learning it is an unhealthy habit to get into. And I do sometimes fall into that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's normal sometimes, and it's a matter also of like, for myself, I have patience with people of like, yeah, they're probably having a bad day and just need to vent. So like, I'm just gonna listen right now because like I would want somebody else to do the same thing for me, right?
yeah.
So I kind of hope that by doing that, like kind of like karma or something, like if I listen to other people vent, they'll listen to me vent, and it kind of balances out. But I think I'm speaking more to situations where like one person is just constant vent mode, and there's not like a turning off of that. And I think sometimes like those therapy relationships can, um, with the best of intentions, kind of lead to people falling into that dynamic.
Yeah. Um, I want to backtrack a little bit because
Hmm?
I don't want to discount therapists, and I've definitely had, I do want to honor like the therapists that I've seen who, I felt gave me the space to like process and start to like move towards accepting myself. And like in those contexts, it wasn't really focused on a diagnosis per se. It was more like, I guess you could say like a process. Um, and I've been finding too that like there are very like I guess specific things about myself I'm learning about, and that mostly learning because of people with lived experience articulating them really well to me is helping me like confirm and clarify. Oh yeah, um, I feel like I need to. I feel like this is really vague, so I'll just like. Um, there's this guy Jay Reed on YouTube that I've been following who talks a lot about like narcissistic abuse and people who've like survived that. And I've just been watching like video after video of him lately, and it's just been clicking into place like a hand in a glove. Like oh shit, like this is everything I've experienced just about with my upbringing and even past relationships. Like it's just making so much sense, and I appreciate him because he's actually a clinician, but he also has lived experience of it. So it's really cool to see that like that combination of like you can tell he's speaking from knowing it personally and like having like healed and gone through it. Um, and I think that's why some people can speak so powerfully to it because it's like, yeah, they've actually gone through it. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. I mean, I think that, my experiences with therapists have been pretty positive for the most part, and I actually have had, more than one therapist support me in like questioning diagnoses that I had been over identifying with at the time. that turned out to, you know, maybe not be the best explanation for what was going on with me. I think probably I was more pigeonholed into diagnoses by psychiatrists.
Mm.
um, and, you know, that's just my personal experience. I see a nurse practitioner now who's great and doesn't really do that. So yeah, I think it's really gonna vary because, you know, first of all, I think just in general the mental health field has been shifting a lot in the past decade. Um, there's, you know, and you know, in the United States, we're having like huge cultural shifts as well. So um, yeah, I think that I've definitely seen more like forward thinking, especially lately around like um, diagnosis and not putting people into a box as much, or like just focusing on, you know, what's going wrong. Uh, but I feel like, you know, I don't know for sure, but my gut feeling is that um, there may have had to be some unlearning on the part of those clinicians that I saw in order to achieve that, because that's not, you know, maybe more recently, but if you look at the past few decades, like that's not really the way that the mental health field has been. Um,
Yeah. And there's like a huge difference I noticed between like yeah, being able to access like therapists that you choose on your own and that might be private practice, like
yeah,
because I think like a lot of trying to think of the best way to say this, like I feel like a lot of the therapists that I think most align with my values and kind of what I'm looking for, they're more people who are private practice and kind of are doing their own thing. And with like community-based mental health clinics, they're people who go to get services there don't always really get the best choice of who they get to see. Like
right.
there's almost like a pressure or there's like such a shortage of availability, then it's like, okay, we'll put you on a waiting list and you'll get to see whoever's next. Like, you know, so
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, being able to like have private insurance and have some kind of choice over who I see as a therapist is definitely a privilege. And I know some people who work in the field who are like, I don't even bother with insurance at all. I just pay out of pocket and pick whoever I want. And it's like, well,
yeah.
that sounds nice.
Yeah.
um, and there have been a couple of times like I really needed something specific, like EMDR, and I did have to pay out of pocket. And I do notice that that experience where there's not as much like clock watching and like things having to be tied to a treatment plan. It's just, it is kind of a different experience.
Yeah.
I do want to ask it because I don't think I did. What inspires you about peer support? We kind of went on a little rabbit hole about therapy, but that's
Um,
okay.
I really love that though, because I was going to riff off that, but I can tie that into your question too.
Sure.
So one of the things that inspires me about it actually is it does give people a choice who might be on Medicaid or have limited options and resources.
Yeah.
Peer support actually gives them a choice. Um, like at least here in Oregon, peer support is covered under Medicaid, so people can, as long as the peers are there, people can choose. And I see a lot of potential for it because it not to like undermine peer support, but it's easier for someone to go through peer training than it is to like go get like a master's degree in psychology.
Right.
So it's
Yeah, 40 hours versus however many years. Yeah.
yeah, totally. And it's the upside of that is it makes the potential for peers to be more available and like accessible, whereas like a lot of therapists and clinicians are, you know, just overburdened and don't have as much time, and just a lot on their plate.
Yeah, I am curious though, like, did you feel prepared to work as a peer after 40 hours of training? Because I didn't.
Um, yes and no. It was how do I put it? There are different things I felt prepared for and not prepared for. I did not
Yeah.
feel prepared to grapple with the clinical worldview. I felt no preparation for that. Um,
Yeah.
that was very
Yeah, for
challenging,
sure.
because when you start working in a clinical setting and you're working with team members who have a very different worldview than you, and you just come out of this training that's like pumping you up about person-centered values and the recovery
Yeah.
model. It's like, okay, go be advocates. And it's like, okay, and then you hit a wall. So
Yeah.
for me, that was the
Yeah,
hardest.
I resonate with that. It sounds kind of similar to my experience where like, I took the training and I was all like pumped up like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. I'm just going to be like having recovery oriented conversations all the time with people and it's going to be great. And like I was not prepared at all for the realities of working in a clinical organization or like that there would be any kind of pushback with like peer values versus clinical values. I was like, what do you mean? I'm here to be like supportive and awesome. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah, that was definitely like a really eye-opening experience.
yeah, it was really challenging for me. Um, but sometimes there are always at least a few. I think even in mental health clinics, there are always at least a few therapists who are more open-minded and more progressive. So I did, I made friends with them, and it definitely helped. But yeah, when you're up against a whole entire culture that's very different.
Yeah, and I think like I got unlucky with my first team because it was like I think other than one person, it was just like everybody was uber clinical and like the icky kind where it was like, we're going to talk crap about people because we're burnt out. And I was just like, geez, this seems like really, um, hopeless. And also, it just felt unfair to like, it felt like people were being blamed for their mental health and some folks were going through what I would consider disabilities, so I just felt like I don't know, it was really ableist, I guess.
Yeah,
Really like, why can't this person just not do that?
right.
um, like the SNL skit where the guy's like, "Stop it,"
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I think now more in more recent years, my experience has been like more people know about peer support because when I first started in the field, it was like I had to explain what peer support was all the time, like over and over again. And in some ways, I'm still doing that, but there's not more of the like I've never heard of this. It's like this brand new thing. What is this? And it's more like, oh yeah, I kind of know about this and like wanting to learn more. So that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah. Um, I feel like too, there's a kind of like what you said with the groups, like, well, I think like a lot of people have heard the terms like self-help, and most people have heard the term like support group, and I feel like that's like a key part of it too. How do I say this? It's almost like the branding, It's like the way mental health clinics kind of brand peer support is like it's just very specific. It's like, oh, these are almost like underlings to clinicians, or I mean, they don't say it
Mm.
like that, but it's like there's almost like a presentation of.
There's a it's a power hierarchy where you have therapists or social workers at the top of the totem pole and peers are at the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah.
That's, you know, essentially like I want to name that has happened and may still happen. I don't where I work now. I don't feel that as much anymore, but I definitely felt that in my first peer job of like, what the therapist says goes, and your peer, you don't know what you're talking about.
And I think that energy kind of um, sort of radiates outward, and I think people pick up on that. Like, you know,
Yeah,
participants kind of pick up on that energy, and it can kind of subtly inform how they see peer support when they're introduced to it. Whereas if it's in a place setting like a group within the community, or if it's
yeah,
like something online, where people are just being open and vulnerable with each other, I don't think people necessarily are coming into it with the mindset of like devaluing it. They're coming into it with the mindset of like, um, man, this is really beneficial. Like I'm feeling heard and seen, and um, I'm even getting to help support other people too. We're doing this together, and I think a lot of people like that. But
yeah,
um, yeah, in mainstream mental health, that kind of energy isn't really conveyed around peer support. But yeah, I think outside that, like when people hear the term support group, I think they're more open to that.
yeah. And I mean, it's different. Peer support can look different in different settings. Um, so I think that can play kind of a part too in people's experiences with it. Um, like if you go to a drop-in center versus meeting a peer out in the community.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
I remember having a request from someone not to meet at Starbucks with a peer because they felt like they had met with a peer support before at a coffee shop and it was like exposing or something when it was like, oh, this is like something I tell people as a plus, hey, we can go get coffee and chat. So it was, it's interesting to see that someone was like, no, please don't. Let's talk in a private area.
Oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, different needs.
Yeah. Um, so what do you think about like the future of peer support, where we're going?
Well, one thing I would love to see is, um, because I've kind of been like straddling two different worlds. Like I've been straddling the peer world, and in a way, like part of groups and online communities of like life coaches and holistic practitioners. And I see like the same values essentially in both communities. Um, and really, a lot of like the life coaches I met also come from a standpoint of lived experience, like that wounded healer sort of idea of I just see like shifts in that field being more oriented towards like authenticity and like owning your stuff and coming from like a heart-centered place. Um, I see like with peer support, just because it's been insulated so much by like the mainstream mental health field, I think it's taken on some of those qualities, but um, I feel like there's like an internal work, like internal process that I feel peers could. I don't know why I'm freezing up. Sorry, I'm
Oh,
just.
you're fine.
Um, Geez, there's just so much I want to say on it. Okay, so I see a need for shadow work in the peer community.
Mm.
And um, I think like a lot of professional peers who come into the field, they've sorry, I'm trying to be careful because I feel like there's it's almost like a delicate issue. I want to
Well,
like do it in a respectful
yeah,
way.
that's totally fine. I mean, I'm curious, like, what would that shadow work look like for peers?
I think for one, it's important to like recognize internalized depression that
Mm.
um, we've gathered from the mental health system, because a lot of us, if not most of us who've been hired by it, have been through it. And when you go through that process, if you're lucky, like you'll get the support of a team that's like very open-minded and forward-thinking and person-centered. Um, but I think a lot of peers have experienced some level of powerlessness or invalidation or some degree of oppression. And, even from well-meaning teams and clinicians, it's just part of the paradigm of that system. And it's really hard to not go through that and escape it like without any kind of bruises or wounding or, from that. So I think some of us as peers have internalized that and have still moved forward in our lives. Created more of a life for ourselves, but we might still be holding on to that baggage of
Mm.
like low self-esteem or invalidating ourselves or seeing ourselves in a limiting way because of the narratives we're given. And it's a really it's a challenging process, but it's a really I think important process for us to like sort through that and process it.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think one big piece of like why peers are important is challenging some of that stigma. So like if we are still struggling with our own internalized stigma, how are we supposed to support other people to work through that themselves?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think first and foremost, like that's probably one thing for a lot of us as peers to look at to check in with ourselves. Like, am I carrying any kind of like internalized oppression or baggage from my experiences with mental health? Um, and then in general too, learning ways we can kind of hold space for ourselves and like um, process, you could say, deeper parts of ourselves that maybe we haven't really explored or looked at.
Yeah.
Which is also very challenging.
Yeah, that I mean, I was gonna say that's a tough process.
Yeah,
Um, it is important though. We also like don't want to deny our shadow selves and act like everything's hunky dory. Um,
yeah,
Acting in that way might be antithetical to peer support and this idea that like we can be vulnerable. Say if we're having a bad day or um, something like that.
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Um,
I will say I'm not sure. In terms of like the unity that we have in Oregon in terms of the peer movement, it just seems like all over the place. Especially with addictions, peer support coming more to the forefront, and having some philosophical differences with mental health peer support, depending on who you talk to. Um, I I mean I've seen all over the spectrum, but I haven't, this is like secondhand experience, but I've heard that, like, for example, in New York, the peer movement is a lot more unified than in Oregon. So I'm kind of curious, like, what that looks like. I have, some really great individual conversations with folks, but I've also had some not so great. I've heard, some peers say that there isn't really a reason to talk about the consumer survivor ex-patient movement anymore, even though that's like why we have peers, or um, just the focus be like uh, very heavy around, how can we get the most billing and things like that. And I think things like that are really the result of co-optation. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's just hard to like, I want to see us have, those core values that we can all agree on and stick to, and use that as forward momentum to, um, yeah, keep the movement going forward. Um, I would definitely like to see more options for peer support. Like I said, I haven't really been able to find one-on-one peer support for myself. And part of the challenge is like I know people who do it, but I know them personally, so I wouldn't really want to get peer support from somebody I know personally.
Yeah.
um,
Makes sense.
and um, in other cases, like I've reached out to some folks who like have a website and say, they do um, peer support by private pay, and I just don't hear back. So it's like, well, I guess they're not doing it anymore. um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, I just more options, more accessibility. It's great that folks who are on Medicaid can access peer support. Uh, I don't know how consistent that's been for everybody who's on Medicaid, because it's like, well, you might get peer support if you have this specific service or not. It's all very siloed. So yeah, I think just having it where, like, there are a couple, like in Portland, drop-in centers where you can go and get peer support, but the hours are really limited. So like seeing more expanded hours, usually, like, the example I'm thinking of is open from 12 to 4. From 12 to 4 I'm usually working, so I
Yeah.
can't, that's not an option for me. um,
It's tough for a lot of people.
yeah. um, so yeah, just really, I want peer support to be for everybody.
Same.
um, and I don't know, it's just interesting, like, how backwards things are sometimes, where it's like, easier to find sustainable funding for maybe a peer support that is like only going to be accessible to very few amount of people, versus like it might be more challenging to find ways to financially sustain programs that are for everybody. Um, so yeah.
What I'd love to
the
see is because in Oregon with at least with Care Oregon's Medicaid, peers can bill privately, and so I'd really love to see either like a network of independent contracting peers who just like work in the community directly and basically are self-employed but like connected to each other, or something like maybe a co-op model
hmm,
of peers as co-owners of a business.
yeah, I mean, I just like, as a service recipient, I just want a list of people that I can like open up, like Psychology Today or something.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
open up a list and be like, here are the people I have to choose from for peer support, and maybe, try some people out and be like, well, I didn't really connect that well with this person, so I'm going to try this other person.
yeah,
Um, Whereas right now it's kind of like word of mouth, or I think there's been some attempts to put provider lists together, but they're not always very well updated. Um, and I don't always know if those lists are just kind of like thrown together or if they actually had the consent of the peer. Because I'm like, I know this person has a full time job. I don't know if they're taking random phone calls from people in the community, you know?
Right.
Um, so, yeah, I think that, peer respite is coming up in Oregon. They have announced, who's going to get funding for those respites, and those will start opening up in a couple years, I think, and
Good.
will probably inevitably lead to more, because I think we're going to start with 3 for the whole state of Oregon. So I think that will proliferate. Oh. I'm not going to try to say that word. It'll expand. um,
I thought it'd be such a cool idea if something like Airbnb or Couchsurfers partnered with I don't know, partnered with some kind of organization to
yeah.
do like on the fly respite.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Like, yeah, you just sign up and crash on someone's couch and then give your support.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I mean, there's a time in my life where that probably would have been really helpful. So,
Yeah. Or even just like like a fairly cheap Airbnb room rental. Like maybe like a AUD or tiny home or just a back room of someone's house and or even I think this is what some peers did like at the very beginning of the movement. They just had like volunteer houses, like peers who had homes or people in the community who had homes who were willing to just like house someone in their own home as respite. And I think it was kind of almost like this underground network. I think that'd be really cool to
yeah.
like resurrect if we could do that.
Yeah, I think something like that would require a lot of trust that is not like present in our community or just in our society at the moment.
Damn, why is
Um,
that? What happened?
well, resources. um, that well, there's probably like really complex reasons that I can't totally,
Well, I mean,
unpack.
I think you hit on something really vital because trust, there's a lack of trust. I think you're absolutely right. And my mind is just going to like, shit, when they started, they bootstrapped everything. I mean, these are literally
Yeah,
ex-patients who probably had very minimal resources, but somehow they bootstrapped it together and but they had trust. I'm sure that was the missing ingredient, trust. I
yeah.
feel.
Well, it probably felt like, after being betrayed by an entire system, that all people could trust was each other, like having that shared experience of being um, psychiatric survivors. So I think one of the things that I have thought about recently is there isn't really, in order to become a peer in Oregon, you have to have access mental health services, but there's not like, and I don't know that you could really regulate this, but it opens the door for people who are not psychiatric survivors but who have access mental health services to become peers. And so I think that may complicate some of the trust. Um,
That makes sense.
I
Yeah.
was just talking about this with someone earlier today. Like, if you haven't had the experience of being behind locked doors and you can't leave and you don't have access to your belongings, um, if you haven't been through that experience or are not able to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's been through that experience, it's just like there's a piece of it you don't get. It's
I would love,
difficult to understand.
sorry. I would love to have some kind of community dialogue because I think that's freaking huge what you just said. Like that is a very it's a very unique experience. And even today at work, they did a online training about the history of mental health, and they talked a lot about like the state hospitals. So that's
Yeah.
been on my mind today, and yeah, I mean it was like literally torture. It wasn't treatment; it was fucking torture.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, like, my experience of being in the hospital is, it looks different. I think I was in the hospital for like a month, and it wasn't the state hospital. So my experience is going to look different from someone who was in the state hospital for months or years. Um, or, like I went voluntarily. Some folks, it wasn't a choice. So,
yeah,
um, but I think like that experience has given me a lot of empathy. Like whenever I go into programs, I'm always thinking about like, like residential programs. I'm like, would I want to stay here? Would I like it here? Um,
yeah,
and I don't think other people, are necessarily thinking in that way. Um,
yeah. I'd love to have a dialogue where, because I feel like there's got to be a way to honor both things, like to honor that there's a group of ex-patients who went into the hospitals, which is a very like unique experience, and like to honor those stories, and also at the same time to broaden the peer movement to include because so many I'm trying to think of there's I feel like the best way I can say this is to share a bit of my own experience.
yeah.
So I I wasn't fully in the mental health system as part of my you could say recovery or whatever, you know. Um, I was diagnosed at 11, saw a therapist very briefly, and then wasn't able to see that therapist anymore, and was basically had no mental health support or services until like 18 when I got re-diagnosed, but it was just like a one-off sort of thing, and I was sent out again with like no diagnosis and like okay, good luck. Um, and then voluntarily sought out therapy a few years after that when I was able and had like the insurance to do so. Um, and was very like picky about which therapist to work with because I went through several of them and had some very bad experiences with many of them until I found like my last two were the good ones. And they
Mm.
actually, I feel, supported me without judging or shaming or trying to pigeonhole me. And that did me a lot of good. But they were also, you know, very maverick and were pretty diagnosis neutral.
Mm.
They weren't opposed to diagnosing, but it wasn't really their focus. So, you know, I was given like a loose diagnosis of PTSD, but you know, that was pretty much it. Um, and then it's only like literally very recently, like the past couple months, where I've been going into these rabbit holes of really trying to figure this out, figuring myself out, and finally feeling like something's hitting, like it's making sense, like learning about
Mm.
OCD and realizing, yeah, these are all of my experiences, like ever since I was a kid. All of these things that I felt like deep shame about, self hate about, like, because with OCD, for those who aren't familiar with it, it includes intrusive thoughts that can be very, very different from normal thoughts, and it can bring like intense shame.
Hmm.
And if you've lived sorry, if you've lived with this for years, most of your life, I think it also like deepens self-hate. If you don't know what's going on, if you think, oh, this is just me, and then on top of that, like experiencing narcissistic abuse, which on the surface to some people might seem, because in some ways it can be so less obvious than physical abuse,
Hmm.
and narcissists tend to be very good at charming people on the outside and convincing them that they're not doing anything wrong, even sometimes convincing you they're not doing anything wrong,
Yeah.
when
Or
the whole time they're really mind fucking you and making you hate yourself and making you doubt yourself. And it's not a light thing. It gets to the core of who you are as a human being. Like it in a way, it really fucks with your sense of identity. And but on the surface, like it can look to other people as just nothing really serious if they don't really like get to know you, or if they don't really like feel what you're going through. And yeah, so she, thanks for let me share all that. But my whole point to share that was mostly that like I didn't go through the traditional mental health system, but I still suffered a lot, and I um, at least growing up, I didn't have very much professional support, which um, looking back in some ways, I'm grateful for because of some of the treatments they wanted to put me on at the time that I wasn't comfortable with. And but in other ways, it also like really debilitated me because I was going through all this trauma without really good support for it. And
yeah. I mean, I think kind of the common thread I'm hearing is like not having a voice.
yeah,
Um, and that, can speak to also the experience of being locked up. Um, so yeah, I definitely like I hear that and I totally resonate with it. Um, and I think, for folks who like have had experiences like your own, like there can, through conversation be that common ground. I think where I don't always necessarily know where the common ground is when I see peers who have only had positive experiences in the mental health system, and there's more of a focus on like compliance or just like hitting the check boxes of what you're supposed to be doing in treatment, and then just eventually, you'll find the right medication or you'll find the right therapist, you'll find the right diagnosis, and there's not as much like questioning of the system.
yeah, and in that sense, I think the co-optation is really obvious there. Of and nothing against the peers who are coming from that place, but I think that's what the system wants. You know, they ultimately want
Yeah.
peers who want to enforce compliance and just go along with the status quo. They don't want peers really who disagree with the status quo.
Yeah, and I mean, it feels crappy to be like, you had good experiences in the mental health system. How dare you? um, but it's
I mean, it's
also like
great.
you, you can have that and also like be willing to listen when other people are saying, they've had not so great experiences.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's where that that shadow can come through of I think in the best case scenario, that person, it's like they're offering another choice to, people looking for support. Because there are people who want, that works for them. They just want, um, the straightforward, how do I say it? The straightforward path that the mental health system offers. Like for some people,
Mm,
it works, and for some people, it's just like it makes things maybe mentally simpler for them and easier.
yeah.
And so it's good to have peers who have had experience with that to walk with them through that. But that also doesn't meet everyone's needs, and if that's the majority of the peer isn't available, then it's also not giving choice.
Yeah. I mean, what's coming up for me is I think this speaks to a need for Oregon to have a peer code of ethics or code of conduct because right now we don't. Um, and other states do. And that might give us a sense of like, these are all, the values we're agreeing to as peers. Um, and, I think there are pros and cons to that. But just like seeing how scattered things have been, it would be nice to see something that can bring us all together and be like, yeah, we have these shared values. Um,
Yeah. I was
I
just
was,
thinking like a MacBo or
it doesn't need to be as long as MacBo's.
but I'm also wondering if that even is the best representation of pure values too.
Oh, no,
Right. So
because
it's like
the MacBo code of conduct is for certified recovery mentors, and then it's also, they use almost the exact same one for clinical roles. So,
yeah.
no, I would say that's, and it goes into way too much detail of things that, like, no, I mean, I'm just talking about like a one pager of like, peer support is recovery oriented, peer support is, um, focus on challenging the status quo. I don't know. I'm just like throwing stuff out there, but it just like
Yeah.
really broad values, not getting into like, you gotta wait 3 years before you friend somebody on Facebook that you gave peer support to. It's like,
Right.
no. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think we need to get into that level of detail, but just like the really broad, like, what, what do we want the purpose of peer support to be in Oregon, right?
And that's a good question. And I think even just having that question could possibly unify peers just to even try to respond to that question. And I think it would, different peers would have different answers. But if we're talking about it, then at least kind of being brought together around that to figure that out. What can we agree on? And I actually really like how you brought that up too, because even for the well-meaning peers who you could say had like a successful outcome from going through the system, um, if they're coming from a place grounded in like clinical values, they're also not really doing peer support, you know? So that's a great point you brought up. Like it's for all of us. It's for regardless of our backgrounds or mental health journeys, like yeah, we need to remember like where this came from and why it's here. It was born from people who were traumatized and abused by the system, and the system has gotten better, but um, there's still a lot of room for change. Like it's not over, and peers, our lifeblood comes from that, from seeing the potential for change.
Yeah, and I mean, just like the way that I think of it is like we have plenty of clinicians. We have plenty of like
Mhm.
clinical staff. Peers are here to do something different from that. If we're just doing more of the same, that loses some of the purpose of peer support to begin with.
Yeah, I would really love to see, in a way, kind of going back to your previous question of like, what's the future of peer support? I would love to see peer support when it's outside of clinical settings, and we already do with like peer-run organizations, but even then, um, and to some degree, like if they're receiving grant money from the state or federally, um, I've been talking to like another peer about this recently, he brought up a really great point that, well, with some of those grants, there are strings attached, and there
Yeah.
are, specific things that government agency might be looking for, some of which might contradict our values.
Yeah, there's also sometimes, you need to report back on data, and yeah, it brings on like administrative demands that can take away from the work.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, I think even well-meaning peer organizations that um, are relying on grant money, and in some cases, like I understand, like that's for some organizations, that's what you need to survive. Um, it can still potentially diminish like peers' potential, and I guess I would just love to see, if I was just to like be, wild with my imagination, I would love to see peers who don't have to rely on any of that and are self-funded. Maybe, billing Medicaid directly, that could be part of it, but you know, for the most part, like self-funded, grassroots, bootlegging where we need to, so that we can really just be free to be ourselves, so we can like define peer support on our own terms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think um, you know, I can't remember what meeting it was, but I brought up the question of like um, because in clinical organizations, if you work as a peer, it's required you have an hour of clinical supervision a month. And I asked the question of like, are we gonna ever remove this so we can have like career ladders that are just peer focused, and you don't have to just shoehorn a QMHP in there to provide that clinical supervision? And the answer I got was no, that's never going to change. So I'm like, well, okay then.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, it would be nice to see that, freedom, financial freedom, and ability to just be like self contained peer support. And, um, I think there is value to having peer support embedded in clinical systems too.
totally.
But again, like giving people options.
Yeah, yeah. I've played with the idea of like the medieval guild model, like for peers. Almost like well, because the guild model was very community based, and it was like an ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
and all the people in the guild supported each other. Like the really early guilds, basically they were almost the prototypes for what we now have as pensions and insurance and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. Like the guilds kind of started that whole thing, as far as I know. And so they would support each other. And if like one of the guild members got sick or died, and their family was relying on that income, like the whole guild would um, come together for that person and like provide support and resources.
That's awesome. I just laughed because I had a mental image of like all these peers sitting at a round table. So
Y- Heck yeah, yeah, yeah. I love
in
that.
like
Yeah.
medieval suits.
But hey, even that idea of the round table, everyone's equal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
totally. And then with guilds, the guild has its own system of progression. You have the
Mm,
apprentice, you have the journeyman, journey person, and
mm,
moving up to master, which master is just someone who has a lot of experience and completes a masterpiece.
yeah.
That's where that term comes, I think, comes from. And
Yeah, it would be nice to have that sense of progression. Um, not even in terms of like a career ladder, but um, I being able to like maybe mentor other peers who are newer, um,
yeah,
or just I don't know. I might be thinking of more like um, maybe being taken seriously by other professions, because it's like it doesn't matter how
Yeah.
many years of experience you've had in the field. It's just like peer support specialist, and it's but it's like through my almost 8 years of experience in the field, like I've learned so much that I didn't just get out of that 40-hour training. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thought.
I think there's value to that. Yeah. Outside agencies might look at us as like, oh, we're all the same thing, but we know that's not the case, in our own
No.
ecosystem. Well, I mean, it's true. Like, you having the years of experience you have more skill than someone who's just starting, who's just fresh out of training. And
Yeah.
that's real. That's totally real. I think agencies acknowledge that to some extent, but um, I love, yeah, like what you said, like, peers with more experience, kind of coaching and guiding newer peers.
Yeah. I mean, I would have loved a mentor when I first started, in a formal way. I think I had kind of informal mentors along the way, um, but having something more structured, I think, would have been helpful. Um, I think, partially to just confirm that a lot of my instincts were correct, because early on I was questioning myself when I was challenging a lot of clinical stuff. I'm like, maybe I'm being too sensitive, or um, maybe I'm wrong and they're right. And, looking back, I'm like, no, I was
Mhm.
100% correct in,
Yeah,
my the challenges I brought up, um, what I wanted to say and didn't. And I think it would have been really nice to have somebody to um, guide me through that a little bit more.
absolutely. Yeah, have your back.
Yeah. And, I did sort of at the time, but again, it was more in the informal sense. And I don't think that that person had the hours dedicated to that role that they should have, probably.
Oh,
um,
yeah.
and I always, like, with that structure, I always remember thinking, so why isn't the person who is the peer in a leadership position my supervisor? Why is the clinician my supervisor? This doesn't make any sense.
Right, yeah.
And
Because they
yeah,
don't know
it
your role.
really, it really doesn't make sense.
It
So
doesn't. Yeah, clinicians don't know the peer role, just as peers don't know the clinical role.
yeah, I think it is possible to bridge the understanding, but it has to be done intentionally and um, with time. You can't just like throw peers under the supervision of a clinician and just expect them to do well with no guidance or training.
Yeah, yeah, and they might end up taking on some of the qualities of that clinical mindset too along the way.
Yeah.
I just want to say too that I have nothing against like the clinical mindset per se, just as a concept. It's more, I think there are actually different clinical mindsets, and
Oh
there just
yeah.
happens to be one favored by mainstream mental health right now for some reason. I think that reason is partially because of funding and insurance and,
Yeah.
um, yeah, different societal factors at play with that. But
Well, and it's easier to study something really concrete like cognitive behavioral therapy
mhm,
versus things that are more nuanced and broad, like humanistic therapy or existential therapy.
exactly. No, that's a great point. That's really a great point because I've really been thinking about like why is it just CBT? Like when they go to school, like why is it just CBT for most schools? Unless you're going to a specialized one. But I like what you just said. It's more formalized, huh? It's like more of like a manualized process that's probably easier to follow. That
Yeah,
makes
it's
sense.
like a step by step thing. I don't know if you could like, I mean, maybe, but I don't know if like humanistic therapy is as much of a step by step process. There are like philosophical values that go into humanistic therapy, but
Yeah.
it's more broad. And I also wanted to say that I think sometimes like what I call like an overly clinical perspective has more to do with like ego and um, just the sense of like I don't know. I think some people like when they go to school and get a degree, it's like a status symbol for them,
Hmm.
and they put a lot of weight into that education that they paid for, and having somebody challenge that who doesn't have the same education level is kind of like a threat to status. And um, yeah, I mean, like I've experienced that, in my work as a peer, and also like as a person receiving services, just like this sense of like, this person isn't open to being questioned. So
Yeah.
I maybe you could put some of that on clinical models, but I also think that's a human issue, and maybe something that needs to be like more vetted in the process of like becoming um, a provider in the mental health field. Like I feel like in order to be a good provider, you should be able to receive feedback,
Should.
or be open to like questions. Um,
Yeah, anyone. Yeah, it doesn't
yeah,
matter your status.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's probably more true for mental health professionals than any other field, or almost any other field. I would say it's important for most of us, if not all of us, to do some kind of shadow work. Like I feel full-heartedly like that should be a mandatory part of all of our trainings. It should be mandatory for clinical training. It should be mandatory for peer training. Like, and I say shadow work in a broader sense, not, I know there's like a specialized definition for that too, but I just mean the process of going inwards, introspecting, being emotionally intelligent and self-aware of our own emotions and where they're coming from, and having the willingness to like go within and explore that. Because like a lot of us, even in the mental health field, um, we weren't taught how to do that for ourselves,
yeah.
and with some of us, we're not even willing to. And um, I just think it's essential. It's like for me, it's like the emotional foundation of this work. We have to be able to do the inner work on ourselves if we want to provide any kind of support to others. It just goes hand in hand.
Well, yeah. I mean, and some of that I think is like the self awareness piece that can be an important part of peer support and also other roles. But yeah, like having self awareness around like when we're getting activated in a conversation, um, or just our own personal activations when like we might self awareness around like when we might be speaking from a place of like our own personal bias or something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
that's that's all definitely important. And I mean, I think like intentional peer support does emphasize like the importance of self awareness. So I think for some folks that may kind of unintentionally lead to some shadow work. I think that's kind of like my experience. Um, but I don't remember, like, I had a different peer training as my original training, not intentional peer support, and I don't remember self awareness really being like part of that training. Maybe, some piece about like taking care of yourself or so, something like that, like making sure you're good in your recovery before you start supporting other people. But
Yeah,
I don't think there was really like as big of an emphasis on like, you know, kind of noticing what's going on in ourselves when we're interacting with other people.
Yeah. Um, I like what you said about the IPS because yeah, I don't want to disrespect it by saying like I didn't get that because it was a really intense week. It was a lot of stuff came up during that training, and from the people who took it with me, like they said the same thing. Like it brought up a lot of stuff for a lot of people, and I think there was like an activation or like a healing process
Mm.
that got started with that. Um, the idea kind of came up as you were saying that, like, shoot, with the stuff that's really deep, especially, and that's really old, um, because like I've experienced that with psychedelics. Like I would have a session and like really deep stuff or really like old stuff would come up, and I would start to process it and even like have like a breakthrough would feel like a breakthrough,
Mm.
and then it's like you kind of come back to like quote unquote reality, and it's like if you don't know how to integrate that, it's or even worse if you come from that into an environment that's not healthy, then it's
Mm.
like almost jarring, and
Yeah.
um especially if it's like if you don't have any support after that too. And that idea came up like with something like that, something that brings stuff up for people. I think it would be really cool to have like a follow up kind of group, like taking IPS as an example, like instead of it just being like 1 week and then like you're done, like having like a group that like a cohort that stays with you for a full year that you can like
Mm.
follow up with or even have maybe like monthly meetings with over Zoom or something, and maybe like a
So like
chat.
co-reflection, but structured around who you actually had the training with to kind of like maintain those connections.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then like, having the focus kind of be on like supporting each other to process stuff and holding space for each other and integrating like things that have come up.
Yeah, I definitely think that, it's so easy to just like take a 5 day training and then be like, that was great. And then, forget about it if you're not being actively encouraged to integrate it into your day to day work. Um, I mean, I was, and I know now that like I'm really lucky to have had that experience, and I didn't realize it at the time. Because for other folks, they just get sent, and then it's like back to status quo when they come back. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Um, I guess I'm good. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we've said a lot. Well, thanks, folks, for listening if you made it this far.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll be back next time with more peer support stuff.
Yeah. Maybe this almost is like that whole um follow-up integration idea, like maybe this is that too, for us, like
Yeah,
who knows what's going to come out of this.
right. Yeah, the future of peer support is this podcast. There you go.